Welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be discussing Against Our Better Judgment by Alison Weir. The subtitle is The Hidden History of How the US Was Used to Create Israel. And it's a fascinating small work. It's actually half as long in endnotes as it is in the entire text. And it's different from the books that I've been reviewing so far because it takes a specific look at the American history behind it. Obviously, I did a review on the Israel lobby. I'll put a card to that above. But this talks about things that go beyond today's modern lobby. It does talk a little bit about the founding of the lobby. But what were the policies put in place to get us to this juncture of U.S. unconditional support of Israel? It wasn't done easily. There was a lot of work involved by the Zionists, and this book really goes into that. As for Alison Weir herself, she's an American who, after the Second Intifada, was really struck by the coverage. She felt it was very one-sided. She comes from a journalistic background, and she decided to look into things herself. And as she studied more, she realized she needed to go see this for herself. She went to Gaza as an independent reporter, and this forced her to learn many, many things that she couldn't possibly have learned on her own. This then snowballed into her creating an organization called If Americans Knew. And the idea being, if only Americans knew what their money was being used for, killing children, etc., they would stop this. Now, I'm very pleased at Alison's work, and I benefited a lot from it. However, I do feel this is a naive point of view, that if Americans knew, they would stop this. I really feel most Americans have at least some kind of inkling that we're not a force for good in the world, even though that's what we're brainwashed to believe. They know somewhere deep down that we're not. America is an obstacle to peace. America is a great committer of evil in the world. But her premise is that if Americans and engaged political people knew, but since that first premise is incorrect, the conclusion fails. So despite the fact that I don't agree that Americans would stop this if they knew, I still think this book is really valuable. And particularly for Americans, because this is our history. This is how we got here. This is how Israel not only bullied us, bullied the rest of the world, but sometimes bribed and blackmailed America into going along. One of the really fascinating things I heard about early on was another reason for the Balfour Declaration than what we were normally told. However, once the British were embroiled in World War I, and particularly during 1916, a disastrous year for the Allies in which there were 60,000 British casualties in one day alone, Zionists were able to play a winning card. While they previously had appealed to religious or idealistic arguments, now Zionist leaders could add a particularly powerful motivator, telling the British government that Zionists in the US would push America to enter the war on the side of the British if the British promised to support a Jewish home in Palestine afterward. So I just want to make sure you're following. It's 1 degree removed. If the British will push the British part of the deal is you need to push for this Jewish homeland. The Jews are saying, for our part of the deal, we're going to persuade the Americans to come in the war and help you all win. Samuel Landman, secretary of the World Zionist Organization, described these details in a 1936 article in World Jewry. Jewry, Jewry. He explained that a secret gentleman's agreement had been made in 1916 between the British government and Zionist leaders. After an understanding had been arrived at between Sir Mark Sykes and Wiseman and Sokolov, it was resolved to send a secret message to Justice Brandeis. Justice Brandeis was a Supreme Court justice in America, and unbeknownst to many people, a hardcore Zionist of the Zionists, that the British cabinet would help the Jews to gain Palestine in return for active Jewish sympathy and for support in the USA for the Allied cause, so as to bring about a radical pro-Allied tendency in the United States. You have to realize, for those of you who are unfamiliar with American history, that the United States did not want to go into World War I, and Woodrow Wilson was elected in 1916 on a campaign slogan, "He kept us out of war." And then in 1917, he goes into war. Similarly, Zionist historian Naomi Cohen calls the Balfour Declaration a wartime measure and writes, its immediate object was to capture Jewish sympathy, especially in the United States, for the Allies, and to shore up England's strategic interests in the Near East. The declaration was pushed, she writes, by leading Zionists in England and by Brandeis, who intervened with President Wilson. Finally, David Ben-Gurion, the first Prime Minister of Israel, wrote in 1939, to a certain extent, America had played a decisive role in the First World War, and American Jewry had a considerable part, knowingly or not, in the achievement of the Balfour Declaration. Now, that's one aspect of it. What else is going on behind the scenes? It seems as though the Ottoman Empire were interested in a peaceful settlement. But the Jews couldn't have that, because if there were a peaceful settlement, then they couldn't have a Balfour Declaration to then create a special home. Remember, if the Herzl had already tried to intervene, if you haven't seen my review on the Jewish state, I'll put a link to it below. Herzl already in the Jewish state had tried to intervene with the Turks to say, hey, we'll come here and you can put us in charge of your finances and we're going to do great things. Just give us Palestine. And the Turks refused. American Zionists may also have played a role in preventing an early peace with the Ottoman Empire. In May 1917, American Secretary of State Robert Lansing received a report that the Ottomans were extremely weary of the war and that it might be possible to induce them to break with Germany and make a separate peace with Britain. Such a peace would have helped in Britain's effort to win the war, but it would have prevented Britain from acquiring Palestine and enabling a Jewish state. The State Department considered a separate Ottoman peace a long shot, but decided to send an emissary to pursue the possibility. Felix Frankfurter became part of the delegation and ultimately persuaded the delegation's leader, former Ambassador Henry J. Morgenthau, to abandon the effort. Now, you have to understand, Felix Frankfurter worked for Brandeis. Brandeis, hardcore Zionist, was behind the scenes doing whatever the Zionists needed done. And this, again, an Ottoman peace would work against Zionist interest to create this separate land. If the Ottomans made peace, then the Ottoman Empire wouldn't have to break up. Felix Frankfurter goes as Brandeis is unknown because Brandeis was a Supreme Court justice. You can't exactly have a Supreme Court justice intervening on behalf of Israel. So this was all done very secretly, and the Morgenthau effort ultimately fails. U.S. State Department officials considered that Zionists had worked to scuttle this potentially peacemaking mission and were unhappy about it. Zionists often construed such displeasure at their actions as evidence of American diplomats' anti-Semitism. Again, if you disagree with Jews on their political aims, that makes you an anti-Semite. Everywhere you look, you find this charge, and that's why it doesn't mean anything anymore. Someone calls you an anti-Semite, you say, who cares? It doesn't mean anything. It's used for everything. You don't like lemons, you're an anti-Semite. You tripped and fell last week, you're an anti-Semite. It's just not a serious thing. So President Wilson, for his part, even though he got dragged into this war, or maybe willingly jumped into it, even though he'd said, again, he was elected on, he kept us out of war. President Wilson decided to send a commission to Palestine to investigate the situation in person. After spending 2 months in the area interviewing all sections of the population, the commission, known as the King-Crane Commission, recommended against the Zionist position of unlimited immigration of Jews to make Palestine a distinctly Jewish state. So here we saw this with the Peel Commission. Anytime anyone comes to Palestine and talks to the locals, they find out the truth. That's what happened to me. It's what happened to numerous people throughout the centuries. Come to Palestine, talk to the locals, find out the truth, because the media will lie to you. This King-Crane Commission report was then suppressed. It was covered up by the Zionists because it made them look bad. The commissioner stated that the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine could be accomplished only with the gravest trespass upon the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. And remember this famous phrase, existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. At the time of the Balfour Declaration, that was 92% of the population. Pointing out that to subject the Palestinians to steady financial and social pressure to surrender the land would be a gross violation of the principles of self-determination and of the people's rights. They went on to point out that the well-being and development of the people in the region formed a sacred trust, that the people should become completely free, and that the national governments should derive their authority from the initiative and free choice of the native populations, as it did in every other mandatory state. The report stated that meetings with Jewish representatives made it clear that the Zionists look forward to a practically complete dispossession of the present non-Jewish inhabitants of Palestine. They were thinking this at the time of this commission. This commission went there in 1917, 1918. I want to repeat that. The Zionists, this is the report. The report is saying, we talked to the Zionists and this is what they told us. The Zionists look forward to a practically complete dispossession of the present non-Jewish inhabitants of Palestine. So when Benny Morris says, oh, transfer was in the air prior to 1948, way before 1948, the report concluded that armed force would be required to accomplish this dispossession and urged the peace conference to dismiss the Zionist proposals. The commission recommended that the project for making Palestine distinctly a Jewish commonwealth should be given up. Zionists through Brandeis dominated the situation, however, and the report was suppressed until after the peace accords were enacted. As a pro-Israel historian noted, with the burial of the King Crane report, a major obstacle in the Zionist path disappeared. The U.S. delegation was forced to follow Zionist directives. Yeah, I mean, who else alluded to this? I'm trying to remember. I've read so many books and talked about so many authors, but there are numerous authors who've talked about the fact that there was Nazi collaboration with the Zionists, and this book documents that. There was even a certain amount of collusion between Zionists and Nazi leaders. When disturbing facts emerged in the 1950s about this, these caused considerable scandal in Israel and led to the fall of the Israeli government of the time. A number of books are dedicated to this subject, and it is discussed in numerous others. In some cases, there were accusations that Zionist collaboration with Nazis had saved people with connections at the expense of those with none. Some Zionist leaders worked out what became known as the Transfer Agreement, a 1933 pact with the Nazis in which Jews who wanted to go to Palestine could transfer their capital to Palestine. As part of this agreement, these Zionists agreed to reject a boycott that had been implemented against Germany. So the Zionists, the idea was, we want to get Jews to Palestine. The Nazis, like, we want Jews out of Germany. Okay, we agree. Let's make an agreement on this. For a time, the Nazis worked with these Zionist leaders to promote Jewish emigration to Palestine. A series in a Berlin paper published by Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels was entitled A Nazi Visits Palestine and depicted glowing photographs of Jewish immigrants in Palestine. Goebbels created a medal with a swastika on one side and the Star of David on the other. So, you've got the Nazis working to help move the Jews to Palestine. But what about the Arab Jews? The Arab Jews had lived in peace with their Muslim neighbors for centuries, for generations. How do we get them to move? Why didn't you move to Palestine? Why would I move to Palestine? I'm already happy in fill in the blank, Egypt, Iraq, Syria, wherever else they are. Why would I want to move? Well, if you won't move, we're going to make you move. While Zionists wished for a massive ingathering of Jews in one state, most Iraqi Jews wanted nothing to do with it, according to Iraq's then chief rabbi, who stated, Iraqi Jews will be forever against Zionism. Oh, that's the wrong thing to say. Jews and Arabs have enjoyed the same rights and privileges for 1,000 years and do not regard themselves as a distinctive, separate part of this nation, the rabbi declared. Oh, can't believe he said that either. Zionists worked to change that by covertly attacking Iraqi Jews so as to induce them to flee to Israel. Zionists planted bombs in Iraqi synagogues and in the U.S. Information Service Library in Iraq in attempts to portray the Iraqis as anti-American and to terrorize the Jews, according to author and former CIA operative Wilbur Crane Eveland. Soon leaflets began to appear urging Jews to flee to Israel, and most of the world believed reports that Arab terrorism had motivated the flight of the Iraqi Jews, whom the Zionists had rescued, really just in order to increase Israel's Jewish population. Similarly, Naim Giladi, a Jewish Iraqi author who later lived in Israel and the U.S., describes this program from the inside. I write about what the first prime minister of Israel called cruel Zionism. I write about it because I was part of it. Giladi states that Jews from Islamic lands did not immigrate willingly to Israel. In order to force them to leave, Jews killed Jews. He goes on to say that in an effort to buy time to confiscate ever more Arab lands, Jews on numerous occasions rejected genuine peace initiatives from their Arab neighbors. And there were other ways that they would bully. I mean, people who had taken refuge, the displaced persons who had taken refuges in orphanages with other Christian families, they were taken by Haganah forces and forced to go to Palestine. Even though the families were happy to adopt them and keep them, they wouldn't let them happen. They wouldn't let that happen. A similar underground campaign was operating in Europe. Zionist cadres infiltrated displaced persons camps that had been set up to house refugees displaced during World War II. These infiltrators tried secretly to funnel people to Palestine. When it turned out that most didn't want to go to Palestine, they worked to convince them, sometimes by force. When only a minority of Jewish refugees wished to go to Palestine, a report by Zionist operative Rabbi Klausner concluded, the people must be forced to go to Palestine. Author Alfred Lilienthal reports that Zionists working in the refugee camps employed numerous means to compel residents to agree to go to Palestine, including confiscation of food rations, dismissal from work, expulsion from the camps, taking away legal protection and visa rights, and in one case, even the public flogging of a recalcitrant recruit for the Israel army. You must go to Israel. Remember, this is supposed to be about saving the Jews, and they bully and kill Jews in order to try to force them to go. So this idea of this being the special place for all Jews, it clearly wasn't a special place for all Jews. Because they hadn't lived there for 2,000 years, even though they claimed to be the quote-unquote indigenous people, even though the Bible, which they treat as a history book, indicates that they are not the indigenous people of that land. So if you're doing all of those things in public, what you're doing in America, because Americans would have not responded positively to this, is keeping things quiet and keeping things silent. Members of the Parushim were quite clear about the necessity of keeping their activities secret. An early recruiter to the Parushim, this is a secret Zionist organization, explained, an organization which has the means we have must be anonymous, must work silently, and through education and infection, rather than through force and noise. He wrote that to work openly would be suicidal for their objective. If it's such a good and noble cause, why does it have to be kept secret? I think you know the answer to that question, because it's not a good and noble cause, and that's why it had to be kept secret. What else is secret is how the Jews think about the rest of us. This is regarding a certain Rabbi Kook the Elder. Rabbi Kook was originally from Eastern Europe, had worked towards the Balfour Declaration in Britain, and eventually became the chief rabbi of Palestine. Perhaps his most significant accomplishment was to devise an ideology that merged a Kabbalistic version of religious Judaism with political Zionism, founding an extremist religious Zionism that continues in existence today. The Kabbalah teaches that non-Jews are the embodiment of Satan, and that the world was created solely for the sake of the Jews. And if any Zionists come across this video, they're nodding and saying, yeah, that's true. Rabbi Kook, who achieved saintly status among his followers in Israel and the U.S., stated, the difference between a Jewish soul and the souls of non-Jews is greater and deeper than the difference between a human soul and the souls of cattle. And that was, again, something they needed to keep secret, wasn't it? Here's a quote from Dr. Israel Eldad. Israel is the Jews' land. It was never the Arabs' land, even when virtually all of its inhabitants were Arab. Israel belongs to 4 million Russian Jews, despite the fact that they were not born here. It is the land of 9 million other Jews throughout the world, even if they have no present plans to live in it. And so it's interesting, they claim a connection to the land, even on behalf of people who don't have any connection to the land. People who were born in Russia, and people who are all around the world. There's a sort of larger discussion there about, what does it mean to be Jewish? What does it mean to be a race, etc. And that's something we can talk about in another video. But what I wanted to highlight here is, what do they really say? What do they really think behind closed doors versus what will they say in public? So how does the lobby in America grow? It has to have the beginnings, and I think the beginning group was like the American Zionist Emergency Council. Here it is. Yeah, AZEC, American Zionist Emergency Council. So one of the ways that you can win support is by getting non-Jews, in America would be Christians, Protestants, really, to help you support your cause. By the end of World War II, the Christian Council on Palestine had grown to 3,000 members, and the American Palestine Committee boasted a membership of 6,500 public figures, including senators, congressmen, cabinet members, governors, state officers, mayors, jurists, clergymen, educators, writers, publishers, and civic and industrial leaders. So you can start to create an atmosphere in which people think, oh, it must be a good thing to support Israel. Look at all of these fill-in-the-blank civic leaders, people in my community who support them. Well, I should probably support them too. But what was the reality of the situation on the ground? This was from the group's statement said Arab forces had abided by their promise to respect Christian institutions, but that the Jews had forcefully occupied Christian structures and had been indiscriminate in shelling churches, reports Neff. So this is Donald Neff, former Time magazine Jerusalem bureau chief. He quotes a Catholic priest. Jewish soldiers broke down the doors of my church and robbed many precious and sacred objects. Then they threw the statues of Christ down into a nearby garden. Priest added that Jewish leaders had reassured that religious buildings would be respected, but their deeds do not correspond to their words. After Zionist soldiers invaded and looted a convent in Tiberias, the U.S. consulate sent a bitter dispatch back to the State Department complaining of the Jewish attitude in Jerusalem towards Christian institutions. An American Christian biblical scholar concurred, reporting that a friend in Jerusalem had been told, "When we get control, you can take your dead Christ and go home." Again, tell us what you really think, as opposed to what the public persona is. People also have to realize President Truman of the United States was the first to recognize Israel, did it early on. How did this happen? Because he wasn't a Jew. While many Americans have been aware of Truman's come-from-behind win over Dewey, few people know about the critical role of Feinberg and the Zionist lobby in financing Truman's victory. After Feinberg financed Truman's famous whistle-stop campaign tour, Truman credited him with his presidential win. When the CIA later discovered that Feinberg also helped to finance illegal gun running to Zionist groups, the Truman administration looked the other way. So I've read a biography of Truman. He credits a lifelong friend, I think from Kansas City, who helped influence him. Obviously, there were many factors that influenced Truman. This is just pointing out that there was also another potentially deciding factor among different factors that influenced Truman. But Truman was not originally a flaming Zionist, you could say. And in fact, the U.S. government, the State Department in particular, the people who studied the issue, they were always opposed to Zionist policy. Here's a series of quotes from Kermit Roosevelt. Kermit Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt's grandson and a legendary intelligence agent. The process by which Zionist Jews have been able to promote American support for the partition of Palestine demonstrates the vital need of a foreign policy based on national rather than partisan interests. Only when the national interests of the United States, in their highest terms, take precedence over all other considerations, can a logical, far-seeing foreign policy be evolved. No American political leader has the right to compromise American interests to gain partisan votes. The present course of world crisis will increasingly force upon Americans the realization that their national interests and those of the proposed Jewish state in Palestine are going to conflict. It is to be hoped that American Zionists and non-Zionists alike will come to grips with the realities of the problem. Truman wrote in his memoirs, "I do not think I ever had as much pressure and propaganda aimed at the White House as I did in this instance. There were now about 1 million dues-paying Zionists in the U.S. If something is the right thing to do, morally, you shouldn't need a lot of pressure and propaganda to get it across the line. People should see it as inherently good, and they should go for it." What happened here and what always happens with the Zionist lobby is an incredible amount of pressure because they lack the ability to persuade people morally. If they had the ability to persuade people morally, that would be easier. It doesn't cost all this bribe money. You don't have to blackmail people. You can do it out in the public. You can convince the public. At the same time, you're convincing the leaders. But the Jews don't want to do it that way because that's the hard way, and they probably lose. They know that. So they're doing it the easy way, which is blackmailing, bribing, putting pressure behind closed doors, money in all sorts of places. So what happens if you're vocal enough against the lobby? Well, these days you get canceled, right? But you can get canceled back in the early days as well. There's a story about a woman I didn't know about here. America's most famous female journalist of the time also attempted valiantly but unsuccessfully to tell Americans about Palestinian refugees. According to the Encyclopedia Britannica, Dorothy Thompson was one of the most famous journalists of the 20th century. Thompson's column was in newspapers all over the country, and her radio program listened to by tens of millions of Americans. She had been married to one of America's most famous novelists, graced the cover of Time magazine, been profiled by America's top magazines, and was so well known that Woman of the Year, a Hollywood movie featuring Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy, and a Broadway play starring Lauren Bacall were based on her. She had been the first journalist to be expelled by Adolf Hitler and had raised the alarm against the Nazis long ahead of most journalists. She had originally supported Zionism, but then after the war had visited the region in person. Do you see something, a common thread here? She began to speak about Palestinian refugees, narrated a documentary about their plight, and condemned Jewish terrorism. Thompson was viciously attacked in an orchestrated campaign of what she termed career assassination and character assassination. She wrote, "It has been boundless, going into my personal life." She wrote of this organized attack, "When letter after letter is couched in almost identical phraseology, I do not think the authors have been gifted with telepathy." Before long, her column and radio programs, her speaking engagements, and her fame were all gone. Today, she has been largely erased from history. In the coming decades, other Americans were similarly written out of history, forced out of office, their lives and careers destroyed, history was distorted, rewritten, erased, bigotry promoted, supremacy disguised, facts replaced by fraud. So getting canceled, that's been a real thing for a long time. What about the UN partition plan? So we talked already before that in the State Department there were plenty of people advocating against this, and so the Zionists had to work not only against the US policies, but other policies of governments in the world that were also opposed to this idea. Loy Henderson, who was director of the State Department's Office of Near Eastern and African Affairs, consistently recommended against supporting a Jewish state in Palestine. Henderson emphasized that the U.S. would lose moral standing in the world if it supported Zionism. At the present time, the United States has a moral prestige in the Near and Middle East unequaled by that of any other great power. We would lose that prestige and would be likely for many years to be considered as a betrayer of the high principles which we ourselves have enunciated during the period of the Second World War. Henderson elaborated further on how plans to partition Palestine would violate American and UN principles. Proposals for partition are in definite contravention to various principles laid down in the UN Charter, as well as to principles on which American concepts of government are based. These proposals, for instance, ignore such principles as self-determination and majority rule. They recognize the principle of a theocratic racial state and even go so far in several instances as to discriminate on grounds of religion and race, which is what we have in the present-day Israel. The Zionists attacked Henderson virulently, calling him, big surprise, what do you think they called him, ladies and gentlemen? Anti-Semitic, demanding his resignation and threatening his family. They pressured the State Department to transfer him elsewhere. One analyst describes this as the historic game of musical chairs, in which officials who recommended Middle East policies consistent with the nation's interests were moved on. There's so much I could cover, I just don't have time to cover it all. When it was clear that despite U.S. support through this bullying, the partition recommendation did not have the two-thirds support of the UN General Assembly required to pass, Zionists pushed through a delay in the vote. They then used this period to pressure numerous nations into voting for the recommendation. A number of people later described this campaign. Financier and longtime presidential advisor Bernard Baruch told France it would lose U.S. aid if it voted against partition. Top White House presidential aide David Niles organized pressure on Liberia through rubber magnate Harvey Firestone, who told the Liberian president that if Liberia did not vote in favor of partition, Firestone would revoke his planned expansion in the country. Liberia voted yes. Latin American delegates were told that the Pan-American Highway construction project would be more likely if they voted yes. Delegates' wives received mink coats. The wife of the Cuban delegate returned hers, at least a little bit of integrity, and from all people, the communists. Costa Rica's president, Jose Figueres, reportedly received a blank checkbook. Haiti was promised economic aid if it would change its original vote opposing partition. Before the vote on the plan, the Philippine delegate had given a passionate speech against partition, defending the inviolable primordial rights of a people to determine their political future and to preserve the territorial integrity of their native land. The delegate went on to say that he could not believe that the General Assembly would sanction a move that would place the world back on the road to the dangerous principles of racial exclusiveness and to the archaic documents of theocratic governments. 24 hours later, after intense Zionist pressure, the Philippine delegate voted in favor of partition. So you have to ask yourself, when you give speeches like this and then you go back on it, what did they do? What did they promise? What blackmail did they have? Now, this is even the pre-Epstein era. Remember that Jeffrey Epstein was a Mossad honeypot, an ability. He provided the ability of Mossad to collect blackmail on many of the world's leaders to use for Israel's purposes. This is pre-Epstein. One 1948 paper predicted that the Zionist strategy will seek to involve the United States in a continuously widening and deepening series of operations intended to secure maximum Jewish objectives. So even the CIA knew this. The CIA stated that Zionist leadership was pursuing objectives that would endanger both Jews and the strategic interests of the Western powers in the Near and Middle East. The head of the State Department's Division of Near Eastern Affairs, Gordon P. Merriam, warned against the partition plan on moral grounds. U.S. support for partition of Palestine as a solution to that problem can be justified only on the basis of Arab and Jewish consent. Otherwise, we should violate the principle of self-determination, which has been written into the Atlantic Charter, the Declaration of the United Nations, and the United Nations Charter, a principle that is deeply embedded in our foreign policy. Even a United Nations determination in favor of partition would be, in the absence of such consent, a stultification and violation of the UN's own charter. And you have to realize, what is the legal basis? Does the United Nations even have the legal basis to give Israel to Israel? International jurist Henry Catan, in his 1988 book, The Palestine Question, writes that the resolution was vitiated by several gross irregularities. Vitiated means made ineffective. First, he points out that the UN General Assembly did not have the authority to partition Palestine. He writes, "The UN possessed no sovereignty over Palestine, nor the power to deprive the people of Palestine of their right of independence. Hence, the UN resolution for the partition of Palestine possesses no value in law or in fact, as acknowledged by a number of leading jurists." Catan quotes Pittman B. Potter's article in the American Journal of International Law. The United Nations has no right to dictate a solution in Palestine unless a basis for such authority can be worked out. Such has not been done so far. Potter goes on to point out that Arabs denied the binding force of the mandate and the Balfour Declaration and says they are probably quite correct juridically. So you have to see a straight line between the Balfour Declaration, the Jewish Mandate, and the UN Partition Resolution. All of these measures were unjust and were done without the consent of the Palestinian people and without their consultation. They weren't even consulted, much less asked for their consent. Catan points out that the resolution violated Article 22 of the Covenant of the League of Nations, which previously recognized the independence of the people of Palestine. The resolution was also a violation of the Charter of the UN and the principle of self-determination of the people of Palestine. It violated the most elementary democratic principles by the flagrant disregard of the will of the majority of the original inhabitants who opposed partition of their homeland. He points out the undue influence of the U.S. president and others in passing the resolution. he discusses the iniquity of the plan of partition, pointing out that the partition plan attributed to the Jews, who constituted less than 1/3 of the population, who were largely foreigners, and who owned less than 6% of the land, an area almost 10 times greater than what they owned. And keep in mind that the Zionists were not happy with partition. Even though he points out it was 10 times what the land that they owned, they wanted it all. But they were willing to take it as a beginning measure, and then they would start wars and take over the rest of it, which is what they've done. The plan worked. The problem is the internet happened, and people found out about their plans, and people are now talking about their plans, and now all of us are anti-Semitic because we're talking about their plans. Well, too bad. At the time, today we see Netanyahu bragging. He's an inheritor of people like Menachem Begin. And what was his attitude at that time? Begin, head of the Irgun militia, sent the following message to his troops about their victory at Deir Yassin, which, as we know, is one of the shames, one of the greatest shames. I mean, there's plenty of shame in 1948 for the Jews, but this is one of their biggest ones. Accept my congratulations on this splendid act of conquest. Convey my regards to all the commanders and soldiers. We shake your hands. We are all proud of the excellent leadership and the fighting spirit in this great attack. We stand to attention in memory of the slain. We lovingly shake the hands of the wounded. Tell the soldiers you have made history in Israel with your attack and your conquest. Continue thus until victory. As in Deir Yassin, so everywhere. We will attack and smite the enemy. God, thou hast chosen us for conquest. Approximately 6 months later, Begin, who had publicly taken credit for other terrorist acts, including blowing up the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, killing 91 people, came on a tour of America. The tour sponsors included famous playwright Ben Hecht, a fervent Zionist who applauded Irgun violence, and eventually included 11 senators, 12 governors, 70 congressmen, 17 justices, and numerous other public officials. The State Department, fully aware of his violent activities in Palestine, tried to reject Begin's visa, but was overruled by Truman. Begin later proudly admitted his terrorism in an interview for American television. When the interviewer asked him, how does it feel in the light of all that's going on to be the father of terrorism in the Middle East? And that's not a positive question. Begin proclaimed, in the Middle East, in all the world. So he wants to take credit for terrorism around the world. And so I'll end with one incident that happened in 1947 of Jewish terrorism. Once again, you're never going to hear about it because the only terrorism you ever hear about is Islamic terrorism. And there is Islamic terrorism, that's true. Or in the case of the Palestinians, their resistance is characterized as Islamic terrorism. But you'll never hear about Jewish terrorism. And here's just one more piece of evidence that the book provides, giving us that. This is relating to someone named Rabbi Korf. British intelligence had discovered in 1946 that Jewish terrorists, including Korf, were planning to assassinate the British foreign minister. For some reason, details about this were heavily censored from the British public for many years, but in 2003, the British security files were finally released. In 1947, Korf and his group hatched a plan to drop bombs on the British Foreign Office along with 10,000 threatening leaflets. We will carry the war to the very heart of the British Empire, the leaflets were to read. We will strike with all the bitterness and fury of our servitude and bondage. I mean, can you imagine this? Accusing the British of putting the Jews in servitude and bondage when they delivered the British Mandate of Palestine to them and then gave them favorable immigration policy. And they're accusing the British of servitude and bondage, putting them into servitude and bondage. The group tried to recruit a young American aviator in Paris to fly a plane from which the bombs would be dropped, promising him lucrative jobs after the mission was completed. Again, everyone must be motivated by money, right? The aviator, Reginald Gilbert, had flown 136 combat missions over Europe during World War II, shooting down 3 German planes and damaging 7. Gilbert pretended to agree to the plot, but instead informed the American embassy and then worked with Scotland Yard and the Paris police to have the would-be assassins arrested. French police, who said they feared for the flyer's life if the Stern gang ever caught up with him, then flew him to London until he could return to the U.S. Almost no one remembers this plot today, but it was the headline news at the time in newspapers across the United States. While some news accounts revealed the full plot, reports quickly stopped mentioning the bombs and recounted only the plan to drop the threatening leaflets. Someone was leaning on spokespeople or reporters to make sure only part of the story got out. Who could that be? But they couldn't keep Gilbert quiet. In a first-hand account of the plot published by the New York Herald Tribune, Gilbert confirmed that the group had planned much more than a leaflet drop. The first idea had been to drop bombs on Britain's parliament, but the target was subsequently changed to the foreign ministry because Korff held a grudge against that office for refusing him a visa to Palestine. In his article, Gilbert recounted a conversation he had with Korff while playing along with the plot, which he continued to do at the direction of the Paris police. He said he told Korff fog might prevent them from locating their exact target, to which Korff replied that they could just drop the bombs anywhere on London. When Gilbert protested that innocent people might be killed, Korff replied, "They are British, so they are our enemy." And put another way, they oppose Zionism, so they are our enemy, which means men, women, children, babies, everybody can be killed because we are the chosen people, we are better than you, you are less than cattle to us, and you're here to serve us. The theme continues, the research is available, heavily endnoted. It's a great read. One of the surprising gems. When I say surprising gems, I mean, I expect a lot of Israeli historians. I expect a lot of people who've been journalists for a long time. But I don't expect a little book written by an American lady who went and freelanced and did this herself with no support from an organization to bring up such great information, such little information. So that's on me for underestimating Alison Weir, but I'm definitely going to be reading more of her work. I can't recommend this enough. It's one of the best little books on this issue that I've read, and it's particularly of resonance to Americans who want to know how our government was pulled into this. If you'd like to support this channel, one way you can do that is by hitting like, hitting subscribe, sharing this with open-minded people who are willing to listen to facts and not just propaganda from the IDF and their supporters. Another way you can support the channel is by joining my Patreon or becoming a member on YouTube. It's a way for you to support the channel with more money, but also it gives you early access to these videos, as well as the opportunity to chat with me about them and understand the work that goes into and the thinking behind. So you'll see all these markings. Part of my work process is I mark everything that I think you would like to hear, but I don't necessarily cover all of these tabs when I end up recording the video because sometimes threads are more relevant than others, and I have to keep the review to a certain time frame. As you can see, sometimes the reviews take longer, they take shorter, but sometimes those editorial decisions are made even while I'm making the video in addition to before. So that's part of some of the discussion that I would do with my patrons. You can also look at my Amazon wish list, which is featured below. And remember that in 2024, a portion of all the proceeds of my channel are going to go to the Palestine Children's Relief Fund, which provides medical care to children in Palestine who would not otherwise be able to receive it. It's a great cause. If you don't contribute through supporting my channel, you could send a super thanks now, for example. You're free to go to their website, support them directly. I think your money will be well spent and well used. As always, enjoy your reading.